continuing to log in, but we'll move forward with that. As we go through, if you have questions, go ahead and put those into the chat box. Emma Newell, who is one of our undergrad students in community and extension leadership development, is going to be monitoring that and being able to respond there and keeping track of your questions in follow-up there. Also want to acknowledge and appreciate Beth Flynn in putting all these things together in the webinar series. Some of you may or may not be as familiar with OSU Leadership Center. Just real quickly.
Dr. King, you seem to be cutting out.
The Leadership Center is actually located within the College of Food, Ag, Environmental Sciences. Okay, she said I'm cutting. Okay. So if I'm cutting in and out, as many of you are dealing with, you have many people working at home on the same internet. So I had to go mention to my daughters if they would not use the internet for at least for a little while as a part of that. So yeah, it's one of those things we're dealing with in this time of COVID-19, but the Leadership Center being housed in College of Food, Ag, Environmental Sciences, we started out as a resource for OSU Extension, and where we had a library of materials we would send out, and over time we've also grown into a training development unit providing face-to-face workshops as well as online, and we are currently located in the Department of Ag the community leadership major, and we work in conducting workshops, but also some faculty also teach academic classes. This is my Jeff Payne, who will be doing the program today, a little bit about my background, my focus, sort of that. So a portion of my role is doing training to also teach within our department, and a class that I primarily teach is professional leadership ethics, which is both an undergrad and a grad as a part of our program, and also a part of the OSU Leadership Studies minor is where I also, that class is credit for. So how do we begin to set the context for this whole idea of dealing with interpersonal conflict in COVID-19? How many of you have had interpersonal conflicts even before COVID-19? Yeah, yeah, I see some hands going up, and if your picture's not showing, you're probably thinking, oh yes, I do. So it's that whole idea, it's not something new just because of the COVID-19. Really, COVID-19 almost makes it even bigger. It balloons things up even more from that perspective. So that's where we want to begin this whole series of looking at some leadership topics around the environment that we're working in, just to give us some of those fundamental reminders of, gosh, how do I navigate some of the conversations that I need to have on a day-to-day basis? Because ultimately we're still trying to we're going to make a difference in where we work, and we do that through relationships with others. So the webinar here is to provide you with what are some of those fundamental strategies and some tools that you could use as you navigate interpersonal relationships and conversations, and differences in perspective and differences of strategies as a part of that. So there again, if you are able to follow along with the handout, and if you're not able to look at that immediately there, this is what you're going to find in there. So you're going to have the same material, but in the printed handout piece. But as we think about conflict, what makes these whole situations differently without COVID-19? What makes it difficult? Well, one of the problems that are characteristics is we often approach conflict with a combat mentality. And what do we mean by combat? What are there in combat? There are winners and there are losers. How many of you want to lose the argument, the discussion? Yeah, it's almost, if we think about it from that combat mentality, we naturally approach it as a battle. I need to get my things out there. I'm really not going to listen to theirs. I just have to outcompete them. So that whole combat mentality, I think, is a fundamental piece we have to be careful of, as well as emotional loads. Are you able to work through some conflict situations and you really don't even think of them as conflict? They're just really a difference of opinion. Let's sit down and talk through it. What sometimes gets in the way is the emotional part. How many of you have emotions? Everybody have emotions? Yeah, I do too. And sometimes that emotions, gosh, they start to get away. Now, I don't want us to do away with our emotions because that's a part of who you and I are. But it's that idea, how do we harness those? How do we use that as information as opposed to reasons to react one way or the other? And then the third element that makes sometimes conflicts different is this whole concept of hard to read. Now, how many of you, when you have a difference of opinion with somebody, you share your perspective, and then as you're listening to theirs, if you look at the screen, look at my face. How many of you just kind of stare back? Why do we do that? It's almost that sometimes we try to hide something. Have you ever had anybody do that to you? You share with them, and then what they do is just look back, showing no emotion, no look. What are you wondering? What do you wonder? Yeah, we wonder, are you hearing me? Are you listening to me? Hello, hello. So it's that whole idea that sometimes we make this game out of it. I think it fundamentally goes back to the combat, that we want to have that leverage. We want to have that advantage. And in reality, I think it makes it more difficult. So I like to begin just by setting the context. These are fundamental pieces that we have to navigate. Just because we have some of these, or we have that combat thinking or the emotions, it's not a good or bad. It's knowing that we have it, and then how do we begin to navigate through that? So this is where it comes in, and also thinking about the results cone. Some of you who've had different workshops with me or even class, the results cone is the results we get are from what?
Dr. King, you seem to be cutting out again.
The
Some of
results we get are
participants
from our
recommend that
behaviors.
you turn off your video in order to streamline your.
Okay, so we'll try that. So our behaviors driving our results. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here. What do you see? Person jumping out a window. Another picture. Ah, that's the window he's jumping out of. Did that provide different perspectives, those different pictures? They really led to different elements of thinking. If you thought somebody was jumping out of a window that could hurt themselves, how would you react? Versus, oh, I see them stepping out the window. So the point here, as we think about conflict, it's not just to think about what behaviors that I do or I follow up with, such as that combat, such as that hard to read, but what is the thinking behind it? Because if we just look at behaviors, we can adapt new behaviors, but if fundamentally we don't change our thinking about it, we're going to go back to the same thing we've always done. So it's that idea, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we use to create them. So sometimes it's just taking that step back. It doesn't mean we were wrong. It doesn't mean the other person was right and we were wrong. It just means we need a different lens to take a look at things, because in today's world, look at these pictures. What kind of environment does that set for you and I as leaders? What does it do to the people that we work with? The whole world is that uncertainty. We hear a lot about it, but let's remind ourselves part of that. we adjust things differently. So I say that in the context of this whole interpersonal. In many ways, these pictures here lead to this type of thinking and organization. So it's that whole idea of chaos. I need to control things, or I need to know what to anticipate, but it's more like this that we can feel. And it's the other individuals that we are working with, maybe going through that same thing. On the surface, things may be fine, but what's happening below that surface? What is the thinking you're going through? What is the thinking that somebody else is going through as a part of that? So again, it's that thinking. Not only do we have that normal interpersonal challenges, but it's also in the context of what's going on in the world around us and that whole element of change. So how do we begin to address the issue? I think one is to take a deeper look at the situation. Take a deeper look. And in the handout, here's a tool that I often use with groups when it comes to how do I begin to look at this conflict from a little bit different perspective. Because both you and I, we see the world best from our own seats, where we come from, the opinions that we have. But as we look at how do we best navigate conflict, yes, it's important to understand our perspective, but it's also equally or even more important for us to try to see things from other people's perspectives. How are they showing up to the conversation? What are they bringing? What are their desires? You know, the emotions and feelings. What do you have bringing to the table? What is the other person or other parties bringing to the situations? The interest and directions. Why are you interested in the issue? Ultimately, what are we trying to achieve? Contributions. Do we ever contribute to our own interpersonal conflicts? Yeah, we do. How do we do that? You know, sometimes, so things have gradually gotten worse. Now I thought, oh, I just got to deal with it. We may think, oh, I missed the training on that, or I missed them following up. So here again, it's not about a guilt trip here, we contributed, but it's for us to be aware how we might have contributed to better understand the situation and how the other party, what assumptions that we have, as well as the needs and the values that individuals have about the situation. So taking a tool like this, sitting down ahead of time and jotting your thoughts and your ideas down around that conflict, I think can be very helpful. Because what could be the results here? What could be the results? And I work with groups around this particular outline, because of those areas in the middle there, or off to the left there, aren't necessarily the magical ones, but they begin to take something that can be very emotional, something that, gosh, you're all tensed up about, and begin to put a little bit more objectivity to it. You begin to break it down a little bit further. And what I often find is people realize, oh, sometimes we have the same feelings and emotions about this. Oh, sometimes we realize we're after the same thing. It's really the process, or it's the personalities that are getting into way. Or assumptions. Oh, I guess that assumption wasn't accurate. I need to change my thinking. So I realize they think, oh, I don't have time to sit down and deal with this. My question back to that and to individuals that you can question it is, how many times have you dealt with that interpersonal conflict? Many times it keeps reoccurring. And we think, gosh, why does this keep happening? Maybe at some point, investing a little bit more time to better understand it and to break it down can allow you to approach it from a little bit different perspective. So just an outline like that, I think, can bring greater understanding and greater clarity to our whole understanding as a part of conflicts. Another piece, a couple other things that I want to touch on in our short time that we have this morning is, one is, how do we engage in conflict situations and conversations? And there's no way we're going to walk through each of the steps, but I want to dig in more in that meaningful sharing when we're trying to do that dialogue back and forth. because I think there's some quick, easy takeaways that we can begin to utilize and immediately apply and remind ourselves on. So I'm going to focus in on some of those strategies for that meaningful sharing. So meaningful sharing, one, is this whole fundamental of listening. Listening is a key element. How many of you, how many of us listen? Yeah, we listen, but do we really listen? Things often get in the way. And one is sometimes that combat mentality, where often we share our perspective and then we want them to respond, but do we really hear them? We just hear what they have to say. We're waiting for our next comment to come back. Or we want to outdo that. We want to disagree with that. So that listening is, gosh, we have to suspend that judgment on elements. Suspend judgment and hear the person. And the second bullet there is move from certainty to curiosity. How many times in our conflict conversations, gosh, I am certain I'm right and I'm certain they're wrong. You ever run into that? I know I'm right. They're just completely wrong. What does that do to your listening? Yeah, it shuts it down. We're really not open to hearing really insights to what the situation could be. And curiosity, I find, allows us to do what? I think curiosity helps me to ask more questions versus making just statements. Certainty leads to statements. Curiosity, I can often, my thinking is to ask more questions. And I think when we can ask more questions, we can discover together with the individual a better understanding of the situation. And that meaningful sharing back and forth, it's not a combat of who can outdo the other person. Really, it's trying to better understand the situation to be able to resolve it to move forward. Now, also in the conflict conversations, ultimately, whose behavior do you have control over? Whose behavior do you have control over? We only have control over ultimately our own behavior. So again, as we think about these strategies, how do we change somebody else? We change somebody else by showing up different to some of these conversations. I show up in trying to better understand the other person's perspective, as opposed to telling them what they did wrong and wanting them to respond. So we begin to change by how we show up. So much of this interpersonal or a conflict in general is how we influence the conversation. And I think many times we want to approach it as, how do I change the other person? And we focus there as opposed to focusing on ourselves and realizing our perspectives there. A quote here, the Stephen Covey, and I think it's so true it's for myself too. Most people don't listen with the intent to understand. We listen with the intent to reply. You know, we can't wait till they take a breath so we can jump in and clarify that. So it's that element that we're losing some elements of listening as a part of that. What else happens as we listen? What are we listening for? How do we interpret different messages? So that message, that dialogue back and forth, words, tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language. How would you take 100% and break that down? How would you take 100% and break that down? Higher percentage on words, higher percentage on tone of voice, body language. What's your thoughts? From some early research, this is when there's been more of an emotional charge to the conversation. And many times the conflict, there's a little bit more of an emotional piece to it. 7% words, 38% tone of voice, 55% facial expressions and body language. So when we're in those conflict conversations and we get that hard to read look, they hear your words, I want to better understand that situation. Help me understand what you need. And your facial expression is just that stare back. What are they going to rely more on? Yeah, the body language. Your words are still important, but it's that element of body language and tone of voice are so important. Now think in our world around us today. Are we having more phone calls and more Zoom meetings than face-to-face? So this is even exaggerated even more, because even on Zoom meetings, many times we don't see faces. And sometimes they're not as clear. So even more focus on tone, on words as a part of that. So there again, how do we more effectively deal with interpersonal conflicts during these times? Is to remind yourself, and for me to remind myself, this is how it's coming across. Because if they can't see my body expressions or understand my tone, whose are they going to take on? They're going to take on theirs. And if even before the COVID-19, there was a little bit of tension in the relationship, maybe we weren't the best communicators, this is going to exaggerate that piece. So that's where you almost, and I need to almost exaggerate that back to better understand how we interpret messages and how we begin to make decisions. This is another valuable tool, as we do that listening piece and better understanding. Because as we're listening, one of the things that gets in the way of our listening, do you ever have the other person saying, no, it's not my fault, it's your fault. You didn't do something. And when they start to push back, what is our tendency is to take that, gosh, they're blaming me. So I want you to have a Q-tip on your desk or your work area. And the Q-tip stands for quit taking it personal. Quit taking it personal. When we begin to listen and somebody starts to push back or get defensive, it's that idea that it's often we take it personal. And when my thinking is personal, how does that impact my behavior back to them? I just have to remember, Jeff, just take a step back. It's often more about them, more from that defensiveness, than it is about me. And then when it becomes about me, oh man, I don't show up as effective. I'm coming more from that defensive perspective myself. So it's fundamentally disentangling that intent versus the impact. The impact was I took it personal. Their intent was more that whole idea of kind of deflecting it, not wanting to look at it themselves. So again, I think a valuable tool that we can all utilize. Also in this discussion back and forth and being able to listen, not taking it personal, is understanding the situation is not the same as agreeing with it. We can seek to understand why somebody's approaching something in a certain way without agreeing. And I think sometimes we're not willing to be vulnerable enough to say, help me understand, and we suspend judgment on the idea to understand it, not to agree or disagree. So remind yourself, just because I'm listening and asking questions doesn't mean I have to give up my perspective. But it's that idea, I'm trying to understand it, and if I don't agree with it, I can continue to try to explore that a little bit further. And sometimes in conflicts, too, a reminder is sometimes we need to be clear versus convincing them. So we've had that dialogue, we're not taking it personal, and we're sharing our perspective. Being clear versus convincing them is sometimes you can go around and around explaining something. In a case, I know this is the situation, you may just need to say, this is what I observed and this is the impact. This is what I've observed and this is the impact. Being clear versus trying to convince them. Sometimes in the moment, do people's egos ever get in the way? They just can't quite say, oh, yes, it was my fault. And we're in this conversation just waiting for them to admit it. So sometimes being clear and your behavior, your tone of voice is still professional, your body language is still professional. So it's that idea of convincing, of really articulating, here's what I believe. and then oftentimes able to come back to them later where they'll say, yeah, I realize that. But sometimes our own emotions and ego can get in the way. Another key thing to remember as we have these conversations is discover the third story. You have your story, I have my story, but you know what? There's often a third story of some combination of both or of multiple people that are a part of it. And that's where I think that understanding allows us to discover what is that third story. Because I think fundamentally, when our conversations are better, this is where we can build more effective strategies. I realize what I may be contributing, they realize what they may be contributing, and how do we move forward? So it's that idea of how do all those things come together? And that's where, even from that unpackaging we did to begin with, we begin to look at things differently. And how do we begin to look at that, prevent that combat thinking, that emotional loads, and that hard to read? And these mental reminders allows us to have better conversations. And you say, Jeff, what happens when? What happens when they get defensive? They become silent. They start making excuses. In the handout that that you received has some specific strategies for each of these. Has some specific strategies and even some words that you could use. Now, the resource isn't meant to say, oh, memorize these scripts, but sometimes when I have those mental reminders, I'm able to better navigate those conversations. A key thing, I don't have time to go through each one of these, but you have the notes there, is defensiveness. I think that idea of defensiveness is often what comes into play. And why do people get defensive? And why do you get defensive? Why do I get defensive? Defensiveness is a fear mechanism, that we fear something. Do we fear that somebody's going to hurt us? Ideally, no. I mean, that could be the case. But in most conversations, it's not that somebody's going to hit me. Somebody's going to yell at me. It's just that, oh, I don't want it to look bad. The ego gets in the way. So the whole idea of, so when somebody gets defensive, and for you not to take it personal, is remember, it's more of that fear mechanism. They don't want to admit of something, that they did, or maybe they just need that little bit of that time and space as a part of that. There again, how do you change other people? How do you change their defensiveness? How do you change when they get silent or they start making excuses? You begin to change the course of that conversation in how you show up and how you begin to navigate that conversation. I wish I could tell you your conflict conversations all would look like this. That success, you follow all these, and this is what you're going to end up with. But life and conflict is probably going to look more like that. But I want you to realize that even when that conflict goes around like that, what do you see at the end? Yep, you see it coming out further ahead. You come out with resolved conflict. So the idea here is, you see the picture there? Driving down the road, what do you see more of here? You see more of the road ahead and less of the rear view mirror. I think fundamentally, sometimes we have to do that. Is how do I move forward? How do I spend it on has passed? And ultimately, it's something you decide. It's ultimately something that you need to move forward with. So thank you very much. I know we didn't have time for questions. Go ahead and put a few of your questions, with those as a follow-up to the webinar here. And just to also remind you, we have a couple more that are scheduled here for the 29th and the 6th, and we're also working on some, basically one a week over the next couple of months is what we're looking at. Some short tips for you to navigate the world around us in this time of uncertainty. So thank you very much, and look forward to your participation in the future. Enjoy your day. So if you have